process. For the second week, we welcome Dr. Jim Sanders to present to us about the Monotheizing Process.
Thank you. I think we might start with a basic thesis of what we're doing. Succinct form of a thesis. That the Bible in both Testaments is the launching pad for the monotheizing process that continues even now, but is far from complete, but must continue to bring God's creation to fulfillment. In other words, the question arises when we come to realize after the Enlightenment and we have critical study of the Bible, that is to say, all that means is you're studying the Bible against its ancient Near Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean background. What were the issues that were afoot in those days that the Bible addresses or addressed at that time? That's what critical reading. It doesn't mean criticizing the Bible, it means criticizing what we bring to it. And if we read the Bible simply with our own cultural garbage, our own cultural givens, it will say something quite different for what they understood. I had a colleague at Columbia when I taught there, Julia Kristeva, who made the point, the better than probably anybody else had before, that in reading anything, it doesn't matter what it is, scribbles on parchment or papyrus or animal skin or cyber screens, requires a reader. And it's nothing if it doesn't have a reader. It's just sitting there with scribbles all over it of one sort or another. And it's what that reader brings to that text that determines in large measure what you're going to find there. And so beginning with the 18th century, well, actually somewhat before that, people began, after learning much more about the ancient Near East than had been known, to read it in that manner and could see what the real problems were being addressed in the text. And that's what we do. We don't criticize the Bible, we criticize what we bring to it. And that means that we really should try to understand what it says and what it was saying in its own time. And in terms of the interest that I have had in a good bit of my professional work, it helps us to understand why some writings of the ancient Israel and Judah were preserved, picked up, and read again, and then picked up and read again, so that they got on a kind of tenure track, so to speak, toward being on a canon. And you see in your list, I just listed 6 different canons of the First Testament. There are others of different denominations or whatever. And the question that arises, since there are at least 32 different ancient writings that are referred to in the Bible itself that did not make it in, then the question arises, what were the criteria? And generally speaking, people try to think about a committee sitting around the table and deciding what's in and what's out. It didn't happen that way. What happened was that what helped them through a crisis, and ancient Israel and Judah had many, many crises. What helped them through was what they picked up and read again. Good morning, Cindy. And then recommended to a neighboring community or recommended to the next generation. And then you have a tenure track toward canon. And that which wasn't picked up again and wasn't referred to again, like the other 32 that are mentioned in the Bible itself, they simply were, without malice aforethought, they weren't picked up again and read. So those are the beginnings of canon. And that's what we have to keep in mind when we're reading. And we seek help in trying to understand what the original, and you have many commentaries and many of them are very useful because most of the reputable ones do indeed follow this understanding of the Bible against its ancient backgrounds. In this country, because of the anti-intellectualism, which has been with us since the beginnings of the country, it required the first 13 colonies were founded largely by very enlightened people from Europe. And they were seeking a new way that the Enlightenment had given them. By the Enlightenment, I mean in France, Rousseau, Voltaire. But Voltaire himself said that the home of the Enlightenment was Scotland. So that the ones that influenced the American founders most were John Locke, David Hume, Adam Smith, and Watt, and some others that were most influential in forming of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But after the country was founded, and 1787 or so, we began to have a country, actually. It required new immigrants in order to cross the Alleghenies, because that was a major hurdle, was the Allegheny Mountains, to try to get from the eastern colonies across to this vast country out there. And the B&O Railroad, for instance, I'm a railroad fan, the B&O Railroad prides itself in being the first to be able to cross the Alleghenies and get to Ohio, Baltimore and Ohio, way out there. And it required, however, for settlement, it required people who weren't necessarily so smart, but they were needed to find a new existence. They were refugees. There were all kinds of people escaping all kinds of problems in Europe and elsewhere, and they didn't need a lot of intellectual endeavor to settle those countries. You've seen pictures of the Methodist circuit riders on their horses reading the Bible. They could read the Bible, and they go out on the ministers and go out on their horses to the frontier, where there were no schools, there were no churches, and therefore there developed in this country a large element of anti-intellectualism in order to be able to settle all those areas out there. But that anti-intellectualism is still with us. It's still a major part of American thinking in some quarters. And a little bit of suspicion, of people who know too much or read it too much back east, But at any rate, in terms of what happened in the Bible, we saw last time, in terms of the monotheizing process, that the names of the various Near Eastern gods that we find in the Bible, the shield of Abraham was Abraham, and they were nomads. You see, they're always casting their tents here and there. They were nomads, and they were going to settle in a land. It was a period in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age of settlements of that sort. And these are the stories of one particular group of people, and they said that Abraham had his God and Isaac had his God called Yitzchak, and Jacob had his, but they get amalgamated, they're wound up into one God, Yahweh. Yahweh begins to win out. And Yahweh was a mountain god, probably from the Sinai, and represented often by bull's horns, crescent moon, and that sort of thing. And that sort of a monotheizing process went on until there was a Reformation in 621 BC. You see that in your papers that I handed out. Josianic Reformation. And they wanted to have all the Yahwehs under one Yahweh. There were a number of Yahwehs out in the high places, in the altars and so on. And that Reformation was centered around what we today call the Shema. Hear you, O Israel, the Lord, or Yahweh our God, is one Yahweh. Well, we still are not very far along, but that was a big leap. And that's what every Jew prays 3 times a day. The Shachrit, Mincha, and Ma'ariv services that an Orthodox Jew, morning, afternoon, and evening services, they all recite the Shema, which is what? Lord our God, Yahweh our God is one Yahweh. But you're not yet at monotheism. You're not yet at one God. You're at one Yahweh of the Josianic Reformation. But soon after that, both northern Israel was destroyed and southern Judah was destroyed. And then the major question arose, well, do we just say, well, Marduk won, the god Marduk won, he did a better job at battling Yahweh, and where these things happen in the heavenly fields, and therefore we'll go worship Yahweh. We'll go worship Marduk, or whatever god won out. But there were some who said no. Yahweh is much bigger than you think. Yahweh is not just Yahweh, is also the God of our enemies. That's the reason we have anything in the Bible at all, is because of those who expanded their idea of reality or God to mean everybody. And that began to blossom until the Persian period, when you began to have more and more people who were persecuted because they didn't worship the Persian gods, or when the Greco-Roman period came after that, they didn't worship the Roman gods because they said, no, we have a God, Yahweh. Now, even in Judaism, you see, it's Adonai Eloheinu. Yahweh, our God, is one Yahweh. They had to get past that. They had to get to the point where they could say, and the expression in Hebrew is Eloah HaKol, the God of everybody. So let's take one little case, Exodus 4, verses 24 to 26. If you have a Bible available, Exodus 4, 24 to 26. This is a little snippet. This 3 verses, 24, 25, 20. It's a little paragraph, a little expression that doesn't fit anything. No scholar has been able to come up with the origin of this little snippet. Here it, all of a sudden, they've gotten out of Egypt, and Birdie, Moses' wife, her name is Zipporah, but in Hebrew, Yiddish, that's Birdie. At a lodging place on the way, Yahweh met, you remember that when you have small camps, Lord with small camps, that's Yahweh. 4:24. At a lodging place on the way, Yahweh met him and sought to kill him. Yahweh is going to kill whom? What is this? Then Birdie, Zipporah, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin. She had just had a child. And touched Moses' genitals. This says, of course, feet, but as you know, that's a euphemism for genitals. Touched Moses' genitals with that foreskin and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. I mean, it's very enigmatic, very enigmatic. And then it was that she said, that Birdie, Zipporah, you are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. Nobody has been able to figure out where that comes from. I'd like to make a suggestion. And that is that it is a beautiful case of monotheism. Because what would have been the God that would want to attack this baby that Moses and Bertie have just had? It would be a demon God. But you see, the editors are already in the monotheism process, so they say not a demon God, but at a logical place, Yahweh, the Lord, Yah met him and sought to kill him. That's not very Christian, is it? Not very Jewish. I mean, it would have been a demon god that already had been said, no, you have to get rid of demons. It must have been Yahweh because of the monotheizing process. So that demon god, you say, no, there is no such thing as a demon god. It's Yahweh that did that. And then Bertie goes through the circumcision ceremony, takes the foreskin, puts it to Moses' genitals, and so on. What you have in this ancient little piece is a wonderful case of monotheism. You don't say demon god because you're saying, no, there's only one God, so that must have been Yahweh that did that. And then you go through the ceremony. And it's I think, a precious and wonderful little bit of literature, a little snippet that endures and survived because of the monotheizing process. Now, we aren't yet where we want to be, obviously. We're on the way in monotheizing. We don't like the idea that our God will be a demon God in the first place, but what they were doing was saying, there are no need of demon gods. If that happened, then it was the one true God that did it. See what happens when you monotheize like that. Then the question arises, what are you going to do with all these gods of neighboring peoples and so on? You say, well, there's just one God. What about all those gods that our neighbors worship? So look, they're big, powerful neighbors and they bow down to all these gods. What are you going to do with them? Well, there were three things that they could, or three positions in heaven that they could occupy. And they would be gods, but without any power. And there were three positions they could have. One was the heavenly council. Second was the heavenly hosts. And the third was the heavenly choir. So that the gods of all these neighboring peoples would be assigned these positions, one of these things. Let's look at Psalm 82. This is actually a record, Psalm 82, a record of a meeting of the heavenly council. God has taken his place in the heavenly council, the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. But they have neither knowledge or understanding, walk about in darkness. The heavenly council is not doing its job, which is to see that justice is done on earth. Particularly social justice is done on earth. As you can see, the fourth was the weak, the fatherless, the afflicted, the destitute, the weak, and the needy. That's what the heavenly council is supposed to do. They're supposed to see that justice is done on earth. And God is saying to them in this meeting of the council, he said, you're not doing your job. And therefore, I'm going to mortalize you. See the next thing? I say, verse 6, you are gods, sons of the Most High off you. Nevertheless, you will die like men. I will mortalize you and fall like any prince. That's a wonderful case or example of a record of the meeting of the heavenly council. God has met with them. In other words, what do you do with the gods of all our neighbors when you say we just have one? What are you going to do with all those gods out there? Well, they belong to the heavenly council. They are gods, but they don't have any power except the one God gives to them. Let's look at 1 Kings 22. 1 Kings 22 is a wonderful example of a meeting of the heavenly council. Ahab and Jehoshaphat have a summit conference, and they are about to decide whether or not they would go take Ramoth Gilead. Do we join forces, north and south, Ahab, the king of the north, Jehoshaphat, king of the south, do we join forces to go and take Ramoth Gilead, which is just across the Jordan River? Do we do this or not? And they say, well, we've got big armies, but they have an army too. We better consult Yahweh. We better consult the Lord. So they ask their court prophets, and the court prophets, of course, all paid by the king. And so they of course, say, Ramoth-Gilead, Ramoth Gilead, go take it. Yes, you will conquer, you will be successful. But they're paid to say that. And so Ahab says, I do have one prophet, and he's in prison. Why is he in prison? Because he tells the truth all the time. You can't have truth going around. And so we'll go get him, and we'll ask him. His name is Micaiah ben Imlah. So they go get Micaiah ben Imlah. And they get him out of prison, and they ask him, shall we go take Ramoth Gilead? And he says, oh, you'll be successful. And Ahab says, have I not told you to tell only the truth? And so Micaiah ben Imlah says, okay, you're going to get defeated. You don't know the truth, you're going to get defeated. And so how do you know that? How can you be sure of that? And he said, I had a vision. And Micaiah ben Imlah says, I had a vision of the heavenly council. And they were in meeting, and Yahweh asked him, shall we take Ramoth Gilead? Shall we do this or not? Shall we support Ahab and Jehoshaphat? And they have a buzz session, and one little God says to the other, and so on, about what to do. And finally, one of them says, I have an idea. And Yahweh says, what's that? He says, I'll go be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. So that's what happened. And then they went up and tried to take Ramoth Gilead and were roundly defeated. But Micaiah ben Imlah had to go back to jail, of course. That's all. People tell the truth have to go to jail. You can't have people telling the truth wandering around. At any rate, those are some of the things that we see in the monotheistic process in the Bible itself, where Yahweh becomes more and more the one God that is the amalgamation of all these others. When we're studying, we said last time that the prophetic corpus, or the group of prophets you see after the book of Kings in your list of the 6 canons, you have 15 prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos, Joel, so on and so forth. And what do? They all are there because they had explained that the reason that Israel was conquered by Assyria and Judah was conquered by Babylonia was that the people had not ate. 2 reasons. One is they had treated the poor in their own land the way Pharaoh had treated them when they were in Egypt, instead of following the example of Yahweh, who helped them escape out of slavery. They were acting like, in other words, you get some property of your own, you get some land of your own, and you forget. It's common, it's just normal human thinking. We just forget, and we think that we own something. We talked about this last Sunday. It's the same thing. We get to thinking that we own something, whereas everything we have is a gift of God. Everything. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a gift of God. And we are but stewards of it for a short little time. As we mentioned last time, this short little life between the womb and the tomb,
sperm and the worm.
Yes, there's a sperm and worm, and then the erection, the resurrection. It's a very short little life that we have, but we always tend to think that we made it ourselves. We earned it. We deserved it. And the Bible keeps saying, don't you ever want to get the point? There is one God, and God made everything, and we are but stewards for this short time of what there is that we're in charge of. And so the prophets, there are 7 different categories of speeches in these 15 prophets that you have there. This is work that I've been doing. I've been teaching for 65 years. I started in 1954. All of this comes out of inductive thinking, not deductive. In other words, I worked it out for myself. And I didn't get my Ph.D. from Harvard or Yale or one of those places. I'm the first non-Jew to get a Ph.D. at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. I studied for 4 years with the rabbis. Now, the big advantage of that was that the rabbis insist that you be able to read all of the sources in the original languages against their original context. And for instance, when I don't know if it was mentioned or not, but I was privileged and honored to be asked to unroll the large scroll of Psalms from Cave 11 at Qumran in 1961. Well, how did I get that? Why was I invited to do that? Because I had been in Jerusalem and visited with Professor Frank Cross of Harvard, who happened to be there, and he was working in the Palestine Archaeological Museum. This was before 1967. And he was working on his lot of biblical fragments from Cave 4. And so he showed me around and introduced me to some of the other scholars in the museum. And it's now called Israel Museum number 2, but at that time it was called the Palestine Archaeological Museum, funded by Rockefeller. Rockefeller funded so much of what's out there. But anyway, he picked up a fragment of his on his table with a pair of tweezers, and he said, could you help me identify that? Well, I read it right off. It was from Jeremiah chapter 8. Not only did I read it right off, this ancient fragment, but I even filled in the holes what the worms had made, because I knew the text from Isaiah 8. I had studied with the rabbis, and one of the things they don't tell you how to or what to interpret a text. They tell you how to read it against its original background, and I had that for 4 years. And so I read it right off for him, and he was impressed. Of course, he was just from Harvard. But I felt that if I couldn't read that beautiful script on that fragment, I should turn my Ph.D. back in, because it was easy to do. Well, within a year, I had gotten the invitation to go back out there and unrolled the large scroll of Psalms from Cave 11, which I did. It was published in 2 volumes in the mid-1960s. And the point is this, that I have done almost all of my work inductively for myself. I don't read a bunch of I keep up in the scholarly literature, you have to do so. But I don't read all the scholarly and then say, well, how can I fit into the middle of this argument out there? And so, no, I read the original text because that was what I taught to do. And out of that, I came up with the idea that the prophetic message, these 15 prophets, are best understood in terms of the covenant lawsuit metaphor. The covenant lawsuit metaphor. Now, I'm not going to bother you with all that means, but this is what it principally means. That in these prophets, there are 7 basic kinds of statements. One is why that prophet should do what he did, because God had called him. Number 2, what was the appeal to authority, namely the story Exodus, wanderings, entrance, because that was the gospel story, like birth, death, and resurrection of our Lord. So theirs was Exodus, wanderings, entrance. And so that is what they appealed to. But the prophets appealed to that in a different way. They didn't appeal to it to say, therefore we are privileged, which is what most of them would do. We're the only family on earth that God knows, therefore he'll take care of us. And Amos said, no, we are the only family on earth that God knows, but he was going to punish us if we don't do what we're supposed to do. They had never heard that. They threw the guy out of town, told him, get out of here, go in there, money down where you came from. Don't come in here saying all these truths. You can't tell the truth. You can't stand it. And so, but that's what happened. All of these were absolutely right, that they were going to be destroyed by Babylonia, by Assyria and Babylonia. And so what do you pick up again? We mentioned this last week. What do you pick up again when you are in exile? You're in a prisoner of war camp in Babylonia. You pick up those which you hated before. When you had something, you were deceived into thinking, oh, they're wrong. No, we're doing fine. Whereas when you're in prison, when you're in destitution, and you have nothing, then you begin to think right. Now, please don't moralize. This is something I say to my students the very first day of every year of every class. Stop the moralizing. You know, one of the wonderful things that evangelicals do is moralize. They moralize out. I mean, but they don't know how to theologize at all. What we have to learn to do is to stop the moral. Why should we absolutize the mores of the ancient Near East, which is in this book? On the contrary, we have developed codes of law, whether you want to call them the Code of Napoleon or of the American Constitution or whatever, that don't follow this at all. That you hope that they're in consonance, but no. We should not moralize. We should learn to theologize. That is to say, follow the monotheizing process, because that is what we are committed to do. We're committed to understand that our enemy has the same God as we do, and we should stop demonizing those that we disagree with. How are you going to fight a battle if you don't demonize somebody? If you don't say they're Japs or Nazis or something, how are you going to fight them? But this says Jesus, and Jesus was the monotheizer par excellence. He was the one who specifically said, love your enemies. But the prophets had said it before. They had already said that you should love your enemy. Not only should you love your enemy, but your enemy, our enemies have the same God as we do. And that is the monotheizing process. It's kind of radical. But if you read the Bible critically, that is to say, in terms of its original meaning, that's what you're going to come to. And that's what we should come to. Let's look at Jeremiah 27, verse 40. When do we stop?
15 minutes.
Okay. Jeremiah 27, verses 4 to 6. Jeremiah 27, 28, and 29 is the location of the debate between Jeremiah and Hananiah, a very popular prophet up in Gibeon. And Jeremiah met with, there was a summit meeting because they were threatened by Babylonia. And so Jeremiah speaks to the delegates from all the countries around about that have come to say, how are we going to manage this Babylonian threat that's approaching? And Jeremiah said that God, the God of them and of us, God of everybody. He didn't just say the God of the Exodus, just our Christian God or our Jewish God. He said the God of everybody says that we should understand that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylonia are going to win this war. And if they do, then the people in exile will begin to be able to think correctly and learn what life is really about. Just as we said last time, so have Václav Havel and Nelson Mandela. Jeremiah was wearing a wooden yoke one day his opponent, this false prophet Hananiah, came and he broke the wooden yoke. And Jeremiah had to pause a bit. And then he came back out with an iron yoke on and said, on the contrary, we are going to be defeated by Babylonia. You see, being defeated by a foreign country was very common because, as we mentioned last time, Palestine was the crossroads of caravans going all over the place. It was a very, and is a very desirable piece of real estate. Nobody seems to want it today, right? Everybody seems to want it all the time. And they did then. And so the prophets would say, we have to understand that even though we don't have our own kingdom, even though we don't have our own government, we are going to be defeated by these larger powers. We have to learn to live with that and to understand that God is the God of our enemies as well as our own. The Bible is full of this, but we kill it in the Christian Bible by putting the prophets last, as we noted last time, and focus upon their prediction of Christ, instead of focusing upon how do you handle adversity. Because what the Bible is largely about is the handling, or God's handling of adversity, or adversity in the hands of the one God. And that's what most all of this Bible is about. I think we should pause and give some time for questions. I can't imagine that you don't have 100 questions. So Lisa, let's have one or two. Yes.
Is there any payoff in suffering? Is there any payoff in believing the truth, even if it means suffering?
Yes, the payoff is in understanding that we on this little pitifully small planet all belong to each other. That's hard to do because we still have tribal thinking in our minds, that we against them. And if we can overcome the we against them attitude and understand that we're all beneficiaries of this precious planet that God put us here on, then the payoff is that we can live with each other. Yes.
You mentioned the heavenly
Council, yes.
the host and the
Choir, yes.
And you talked about the council doing things. What does the host do? What does the host do? The heavenly host.
Oh, they're the heavenly armies.
Oh, okay.
And you had a tendency in antiquity to say that our God has a bigger army than your God, and well, actually, it's not just in antiquity, but we have a better religion than you have, or we have a better understanding of God's gifts than you do, or something like that. One of the payoffs is to understand that Christ, our Lord, God's Son, is not a better understanding of God than others, but for us to understand that the one God of all chose to live a human life and suffer what the biggest empire on earth had to offer was crucifixion, because he told the truth. And that it's a very disturbing Bible if it's read against its original backgrounds. Very disturbing. And it should be. It stirs us up, and should, to help us to understand that our enemies don't need to be our enemies.
With this idea of the heavenly host morph into our idea of the choirs of angels, archangels, powers, etc.?
I don't know what the numbers would be. Are you asking which was the bigger, the choir?
No. But I mean, well, I don't know exactly what most people are doing here. I mean, the Orthodox are taught that there are 12 choirs of angels.
Yes.
Each of those choirs of angels has a specific duty toward humanity. Each of us has a guardian angel.
Yes.
So what I'm asking is this idea of the hosts in heaven morph into this more elaboration of 12 hosts, and then of course we have others.
I suppose one could say that.
I have another question. Sorry. You started off by saying that we bring into everything we read, we bring our own real response, our own life experience.
Yes.
So what's the point of reading anything? Is there any validity in anything really? If all we're bringing to it is our own tiny little life experience.
Well, if the book that you're reading or whatever you're reading has arisen from your own culture, then it is understandable that you will get the point of the author. But if it's an ancient writing coming from a very strange culture and a strange situation to us, then we need to be able to understand what it said against the background of that period.
So it's not just bringing to it your own experience, it's actually a scholarly study of it.
But we're going to bring our own experiences anyway. How do we restrain that and try to understand what the original meanings were?
How do you do that?
By studying it against the background of the ancient Near East. And there are very good commentaries that do that for us. Very good commentaries out there. Yes, sir.
So if you go to an ancient writing with your own experience and you try to absorb what you can from it, now doesn't that become an experience of yourself so that you've changed? And I mean, pick up the next bit of ancient writing, you're coming to it with a different experience.
Yes.
Yes.
If I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's kind of a directive to try to be more open, I guess.
Yes. Yes. To other experiences and to other cultural situations on this very small, pitiful little planet.
Yeah. And on this small life that you were talking about.
Yes. It's you see, I'm not coming to you to say read your Bible, because that would mean you read it, bringing to it your situation only, which is what the evangelicals do in the anti-intellectual atmosphere of this country that's seemingly deeply embedded. Is you read it out of your own experience. And I'm saying, though, that that's a false reading, that what we need to do is to understand it against its own background. And there are plenty of good commentaries for that. Cindy, I'm sure, could recommend excellent ones for you.
Could you recommend something?
Well, the Anchor Bible series is very good. Anchor Bible series. Harper's Bible Commentary is very good.
Thank you.
Those are ones that come to mind at the moment. Or you have some guy like me or others to come and talk about it, which I commend you for doing, even though it may not be exactly what you wanted to hear.
It requires a lot of effort, actually.
Yes, it requires some. It comes from a very strange period of time. I mean, the ancient Near East is very, very different from our even the Greco-Roman world is quite different from ours. We benefit tremendously from the Greek culture, tremendously. I mean, think of all of the that we benefit from Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, all the rest of it that produced the Enlightenment period of England and France in the 18th century. and and brought over to this country. We should have come to appreciate what all that means, and I just commend as highly as I can trying to understand the Bible against its own background. It's worth it, and we have to ask, why did the idea of a Bible arise? Why did they recommend some of this stuff to the neighboring community and to the next generation? Because that was the beginnings of canon, of the idea of a Bible or of Scripture. And they picked up and read again what was helpful to them in crisis. Yes.
I was interested in what you said. I'd always thought there was sort of a committee that, said, no, we'll put this in, it all sounded like Monty Python. But you said it came about not through a committee because basically what was being used, is that right? What was popular?
Yes, what helped the most, not necessarily popular, because what helped the most was times of crisis. Period. Because you see, this little piece of real estate wandered by. I gave you the handout of all the power flows. It's very desirable. They were constantly being threatened, constantly. So the Bible, it comes from periods of crisis, constant crisis, and particularly when Rome came in 63 BC, first century. Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II couldn't decide who should be priest, who should be king of the Hasmonean dynasty. And so they appealed to Pompey, who was up in Damascus at that time, and said, would you use your good offices of Rome to decide for us this problem we have? And Pompey said, oh yes, of course, but don't come up here, I'll come down there. And he came down with all these armies, and Palestine, or Syria, Judea, became a Roman province. But it was the most problematic province of the whole Roman Empire. They had more rebellions against Rome than any other province of the whole empire. They had to draw legions from other provinces to fight all these rebellions. And our Lord was born and had his ministry precisely in one of the most critical periods of that time. And the war clouds were rising, and zealots wanted to get rid of Rome. I mean, they hated Rome because they wanted to make them worship the Roman gods. And Jesus was born right in the middle of that. And when we read his saying, when they ask you to take your cloak 1 mile, take it for a second mile. That's the humility that Roman soldiers subjected the citizens to, very much the humility that Palestinians experience every day with the Jews, with the Israelis. Very similar. And Jesus would say, but remember, they too belong to God. That would have been hard, very hard. But that's the reason he got crucified. Or the major reason. Any other questions? I really appreciate your coming out. This is not easy stuff. I don't come around offering easy answers to anything.
We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
We look forward to next week when we will be focusing upon the New Testament and what our Lord's ministry was about at that time in the light of the monotheizing process. Thank you. Thank you.